Thank you, everyone. Yeah, apologies, I'm going to have to speak in English because I'm a typical Brit that did not learn another language. But hopefully you'll follow me without any problems. So my background was in traditional PR before I got into digital marketing. I did a PR degree, I worked at traditional PR agencies, I worked in in-house PR roles, but I was always more interested in online than I was in offline. So I started looking at digital marketing companies that maybe I could go and work with that also had an interest in PR. And I was lucky enough to get a good job with an SEO agency and start their PR team. But what that meant is a lot of learning for me in terms of working out what campaigns would work from a PR perspective, but which ones would also have SEO benefit and how I could combine the two together. And I speak at quite a few conferences, so I see a lot of talks. But what I see a lot of is people like me standing up and going, look at this work I did, look how amazing this is. Hopefully this will inspire you to do amazing work. But not everything that we do is amazing. We all have failures, we all have mistakes that we've made, but people don't often get up and talk about them because we want you to think that we're amazing at everything. So I thought it'd be interesting, rather than doing the usual, look at some amazing things I've done, to talk you through some of the mistakes that I've either learned myself or that I see often with people that I talk to, so that it would be a little bit different. So instead of talking about great stuff, I'm going to be talking about why things fail and hopefully making sure that if you're running any digital PR campaigns yourselves, you'll be able to learn from these mistakes and not make them yourself. But first of all, I just wanted to say, people always say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, which is true, but failure is also in the eye of the beholder. So just because I might consider something a failure doesn't mean that someone else would, because it all comes back to making sure you've got the right objectives and KPIs and everyone's on the same page from the very start. Because if your main KPI for a digital PR campaign is, say, how many links that it gets, then obviously a campaign that gets loads of coverage and really great press but no links would be seen as a failure. But if your objective is to raise brand awareness for a brand and get it seen by more people, then actually it might not matter how many links you get. And actually not getting links might still help with SEO success anyway, with more and more of what we're seeing. So I just wanted to start with that. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is audiences. Someone was asking me yesterday, where do you start with a PR campaign? An audience is always our starting point. But when I talk about audience, I talk about two different types of audience. So there's the brands that you are at the top, and then you've got the middle audience, and you've got the end audience. Most of the time, we just focus on the end audience, and by that, I mean the customers that we're trying to attract, right? The people that we're trying to ultimately drive to the website to take whatever action that might be. And they are very important. But when we're talking about PR, we've got this middle audience, which is the journalists, the influencers, the people that we need to talk about our brand in order to reach that end audience. And it's important to do research of both of those and spend as much time understanding them as possible. And forgetting that middle audience and not researching that properly is often where a lot of people fall down. You create a campaign or you create some content that the end audience might be interested in, but you haven't considered how you're actually going to get that to the end audience. Some of the ways that we do this, so we use a tool called BuzzSumo. I don't know how many people are familiar. A couple of people nodding and raising hands. It's probably one of the most useful tools that I use, and it's not super expensive. But one of the things that we can do is we can put a topic in there that's relevant to our client and start to see which articles are being written that get a lot of shares and a lot of engagement around that topic to help us to come up with ideas and start to see what the audience is engaging with. So this was looking at the World Cup, which I thought would be interesting since that we have the Rugby World Cup going on at the moment. And this is just showing us from a top level, here's the most shared articles around the World Cup, which is sort of interesting at a glance, but I always want to go deeper. And I also never imagined working in PR that I would spend as much time in Excel as I do, but pivot tables suddenly became my life. And that's what I tend to do, is go deeper, so export all of those articles and start to get some more meaningful insights from them. So one of the things that I'll do, so I export kind of the top 200 articles that come up, and start to analyze, well, what is it that made people write about it? And how might that work for my client? What could we learn from that? So some examples here are, so match results were the number one thing that people were writing about, which feels like it would be an obvious thing from a sporting event. So that wasn't ultimately shocking. And then political kind of motivations and stories came second. But then we can start to guess how we could get in the middle of those conversations. So for example, if we were a betting client, we might be able to offer odds for what the next result might be. Guides is up there, so we might be able to offer guides on what might be coming up in the next stage of the tournament. This is the kind of stuff that when we go deeper, we can start to learn from and understand this is the categories of content that the audience is engaging with. What we also want to do is start to think about the components and the formats that are making up that content that people are engaging with. So again, this requires some research. I did this looking at the travel sector, and I wanted to see what are the most engaging formats that people are using, and how does that change across different types of press? So things like whether it was featuring an expert, whether there were deals, whether there were reviews, is it road trips and bucket list destinations that travel press are writing about? What is it that the press seems to be focused on? And we can see some interesting things, but we can also start to see that there's a difference between what our kind of national press are writing about compared to lifestyle press, compared to travel-specific press. So we can see that for lifestyle press, anything that's to do with Instagram, Instagrammable locations, that's what they're featuring heavily. But if we want to get in those huge national press with lots of reach, well, that Instagram's not the way to do it, and actually expert content is more relevant for them. So it's important to start understanding the different journalists and the different publications to understand how we can give them what they need to get them to write about our clients. This is what I call my kind of Venn diagram of a perfect campaign. And I think you need to have all three parts to have success. So it's important to understand what the end audience is interested in. That's really important because that's who we want to reach. That's who we want to drive to our site. That's who we want to get sales or conversions or whatever it might be from. But it's also really important to understand what those journalists are writing about, as I've just said, because even if you have something interesting to the end audience, if journalists don't want to write about it, you're still not going to see success from a PR point of view. But the other thing that people sometimes don't pay enough attention to is the relevancy that it has to the brand or to the client. We see a lot of campaigns where people will be like, so like Game of Thrones, when that was really popular, there were so many campaigns put out there to do with Game of Thrones, but they had nothing to do with the client that was putting the campaign out there. And that doesn't work either. You need to balance all three of these different things to have a campaign that will really deliver. And it's all about finding the right journalist at each title, rather than just going, okay, well, that title is the one that I want to reach. We need to find the person that's there that we're going to approach, because we don't email publications, we email people. We email people's email addresses. So you need to research each journalist, and you need to make sure you're establishing the relevancy to them. So when we pitch them a story, we don't just send them kind of a cold mail merge email. We say, hey, I saw that you wrote this article before, and because of that, I thought that this campaign that I've been running would be really relevant to you, rather than just sending them a cold pitch where they're like, why are you sending me this? This is not of interest to me. And that helps us to get a much better result. The next mistake that I see people making is not understanding that size really does matter when it comes to campaigns. And I mean this in two ways. So this is some research that Muckrack did, and it looked at journalists and their use of social media. And it found that more than 41% of them, when considering whether to write a story, they think about how shareable that story is. And that's across all social media, so not on a particular channel. But that's really important, because if that's what journalists care about and that's who we're pitching, then we need to care about that as well. Because if we're pitching them a story that seems really shareable and really engaging, they're more likely to write about our client and our campaign than they are about one that doesn't have that thought in it. And the other stats are just looking at how many journalists track how many shares that their campaigns get, which, as you can see, is even higher. So if this kind of shareability is so important to journalists, which is who we're trying to get to write about our clients, it needs to be important to us. So we need to make sure that we can sum things up in the character limit that's prescribed by each social channel. So for Twitter, that's 280 characters or less. So if we can't tell our story or kind of give the headline of our campaign in that many characters or less, then it's not going to be successful because it's not shareable. And those character limits vary depending on social network, and the formats that you need vary per social network. So I know that in Sweden, Twitter's not as big as it is in the UK, which I've learned. But Instagram, for example, if you're going to share something on Instagram, you need to make sure you've got good visuals. So it's important to consider these things of how journalists are sharing things and what they're tracking to make sure you're giving them something they can use. But conversely to that, you also need to be able to fill an article. So as well as being able to sum it up in as few words as possible, you need to make sure that you're actually giving them enough that they can write a whole article about it. And again, this varies by publication and by journalists that you're pitching. So this is taking a look at 2 different publications, and you can see that there's a big difference in terms of the average content length. I'm definitely going to pronounce these wrong, so apologies. But Aftonbladet, sorry. But you can see that, shorter articles for them tend to be more engaging. So if you're pitching them, you can actually go with quite a short story because that's what they're publishing and that's what's getting engagement. Whereas Expressen, they're doing better with long-form articles. So if you're pitching them about your client and your campaign, you need to make sure you're giving them enough because if their articles are, nearly 3,000 words, that's really long-form content. So if you're pitching a journalist there, you're going to need to give them enough that they can actually write nearly 3,000 words about the topic. So it's really important to bear this in mind when you're thinking about who you're pitching and how you're pitching them and what you include in your pitch email. Think about what they're going to need to be able to actually pick that story up and run with it. The next mistake is not having the full package. And I mean a few things like that by this. Have you guys heard this saying before? A picture's worth 1,000 words. That's quite a common saying kind of worldwide. But it's really true. Like we all kind of know that, but I think we forget it sometimes when we're putting our campaigns together. But when was the last time you saw a news story without an image attached to it? You can't think of one because it just is how it goes, especially in an online world. So when we were thinking about print PR, we could maybe get away with it because if you think of the way a newspaper or a magazine is laid out, there's some images, but there's some stories that don't have images because that's not how the layout works. Whereas with an online story, which is what we're pitching, every single article has to have at least one image attached to it. So if we're pitching the journalist, we need to be sending them an image so that we're taking the work out for them. They don't have to go searching for an image to fit the article. We've already provided one. We're being helpful. So always ensure that you've got high quality imagery to accompany whatever you're pitching, your campaign, your story, whatever it might be. But it's not just imagery. You need to think about how you share the visuals. So different publications have different preferences for, say, WeTransfer over Dropbox. You need to think about that and make sure you're sharing it in the right way. But if you're sharing a WeTransfer link, the journalist has to trust you that what you're sending them is what they need and what they want, because you don't see in the same way as Dropbox, you don't see what you're downloading when you click a WeTransfer link. So you need to describe exactly what's in there. So we might say, here's some product shots. It shows the product in all the different color variations, and there's also some lifestyle shots in there. So they can see, okay, that gives me what I need. Or they might come back and say, well, actually, I need cutouts for my article. So do you have those? So you need to be as helpful as possible and also provide high and low-res images. So even though we're predominantly pitching for online press, because that's what's going to help us from a digital point of view, sometimes that press also goes into print, and therefore they will need a high-res version in order to print. So we need to consider and provide both options. It's not just kind of image and static visual content, though. It's also video content, although this is surprising. So this is a big difference, looking at some Swedish sites to it is looking at English sites. It's actually much lower in terms of video content that can be seen. So this is looking at the percentage of articles that also have video in. So it is quite a low percent over here. I've only done this for 3 sites, though. I've not done it for a huge range. But if you compare this to the UK, it's vastly different. In terms of, so just like less than 10% across the board, whereas, approaching nearly all the articles in the UK. And that's a similar trend if I look at other countries as well. So if I look at the US, it follows a similar trend to the UK. So I guess if you're only pitching within Sweden, video might not need to be as big a part of your strategy, but for anyone that works on an international scale and works with clients, or you are from an in-house brand that works in different countries, video is still something that you really need to be conscious of, because if you want to pitch international press, the chances are you'll need to be providing some kind of video content or give them some inspiration for some content. In terms of the package, I'm not just talking about image and visuals either. This is Maya Angelou. And again, you've probably heard this quote before. I've learned people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel. And again, anecdotally, this is something we know. If you think about your memories, you probably remember things because of how you felt at the time. It's the reason that when we're younger, we love Disney movies. You know, that roller coaster in Lion King, you're happy, you're sad. You remember the film because of the emotions, the roller coaster that takes you on. But again, we forget this with marketing, and we forget this with PR. We forget that our customers, our people, they are human. They relate to emotions in the same way that we relate to emotions. So calling them users or visitors to the website takes away that human aspect, and I think that's why we forget this so much. In the media, they have another saying, if it bleeds, it leads, which is tied to this. It's the reason that anything that's, any kind of war conflicts or any suffering, that always takes the lead story on the news. Because we feel something when we hear that. When we see a story about a person, in need, we feel something, we connect with it. So you need to think about what emotions you're trying to trigger from your campaigns and from your content and the stories that you're creating. Because there needs to be some kind of emotion. Otherwise, it's just, so what? Why would I care? This is looking at the wheel of emotions because there's so many different types of emotions that we can appeal to. And they're not all good and they're not all bad, and they're sometimes in between. And it's not that one is better than another. So there's a really good book called Contagious, written by Jonah Berger. And this is all around why things go viral, why people share things on the internet. Really great book if you haven't read it. But he has this matrix in here on emotions, and he talks about high arousal versus low arousal, which basically means high likelihood of taking action versus low likelihood of taking action, and positive emotions versus negative. And what we can see is it's not just positive emotions that prompt action, actually really negative ones do too. So if you can get someone excited, if you can amuse someone, if you can create awe in someone, they're likely to share that content. But conversely, if you can get people riled up, if you can get someone, people angry about something, they're also likely to share that. And I'm not suggesting you get people angry at your brand or your client, but we can get people angry about a situation, and we can unite people in that anger and talk about how we're doing something about it. So there's different ways that we can use this, but we need to bear it in mind. And this is a quote from the book. He says, rather than harping on features or facts, we need to focus on feelings, the underlying emotions that motivate people to action. And it's true, data in itself, although data is great for PR and we get loads of great stories out of data, it's not the data itself. It's not having that number. It's people thinking how that number and how that data or that fact relates to them in their lives and how it might affect them, which is an emotional connection that we have to that. So we need to remember this, and I think it's often forgotten in marketing. And he says, when we care, we share, which is true. You don't share something on social media unless you have some kind of attachment to it, unless it's made you feel something that makes you want to share it. Case studies are nearly always the best way to do this. So having real human case studies, again, journalists often want them, but it allows you to bring that human element and those emotions really easily. So that's kind of my best advice for doing this. If you do pitch broadcast media as well as online, you need to make sure you've got a strong guest, someone that will create that emotional appeal and people will relate to. So not someone that might be very corporate and just, speak monotone and that people aren't going to relate to and they're not going to show any emotion in how they come across. So speaking of which, I've got what I think is a powerful story to share with you. So there is a father and his son. And the father's got the day off work. So he says to his son, the son's in the summer holidays, he says, we can go anywhere you want. Where do you want to go? And the son says he wants to go to the woods. He wants to go have a walk in the woods, see some animal, and spend some quality time with his dad. So the dad says, that's fine, we'll do that. So they get up, they get ready, they get in the car, they're driving on the way to the woods. On the way to the woods, however, they get in a horrific car accident. It's really serious. The ambulance shows up and they say, there's no way to save the dad. He's gone. The son, however, is in a really critical condition. He can be saved, but he needs to get to the hospital ASAP. But the dad's already dead. He's pronounced dead at the scene. So they take the son to the hospital. the hospital say, he needs to be prepped for surgery immediately if we're going to save his life. So they get him ready, they get him in the surgery, and the surgeon walks in, and the surgeon says, oh, I'm sorry, I can't operate. And they say, why? And the surgeon says, well, that's my son. So there's some confused faces in the room, which is what normally happens at this point. The surgeon is his mum. But most people, when they hear that story, they think, but the dad already just died, so like, who's the surgeon? How can it be his son? Which brings me to my next point, which is all around bias. So this is not my story. This is taken from a TED Talk, but it works. And falling victim to bias, unconscious bias in particular, this is something we do a lot. It's unconscious bias, right? We don't know that we're doing it until we're called out on it. And I've mentioned that story in a few talks, and I always get people coming up to me after being like, I can't believe, I always thought I'm very much equal rights, but I definitely thought it was the dad. Or someone came up and they were like, I was convinced it was two gay dads. I just had that. And they were like, well, what does that say about me? Is that better or worse than just... And I was like, I don't know. I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying. This is something that we all experience. I thought the same thing at first when I heard the story. I was like, what? And then I was like, of course, it's the mum. But unconscious bias, it's a big thing, and it can affect us on all our marketing and all of our campaigns. This is Project Implicit. I'm not sure whether anyone's heard of it. It's a collaboration between Harvard University and some other people. And it aims to test our unconscious bias on various different things. So you go on there and you take a test, and it kind of shows you different things, and you have to press a different key quickly for different things. So it'll show you gender or race and take you through a test. And essentially it gives you results. These aren't my results. These are screenshots. But it shows you, what your affinity is to different. This is looking at race, and then they have some that look at the arts. So whether you see males more aligned to science and females to arts and that kind of thing. And it's really interesting. It's free. I recommend you go and have a look, because it can tell you a lot about yourself that you didn't know. And once you become aware of it, it's less unconscious bias and something that you can be conscious of and you can change. So what I would encourage you to do is think back to the audience from the start that you worked out you're trying to reach, and try and replicate them when you're coming up with your marketing, your PR ideas, just to make sure there isn't any unconscious bias that's creeping in that you might not realize, actually, this is only going to be catered towards a certain type of person, and we're ignoring all these other customers that we might be alienating through this campaign. And we do see that happen a lot. But it's not just unconscious bias. There's knowledge bias as well. And you have this often if you work in-house, but you can also get it agency side when you work with a client for a certain amount of time. You start to, you acquire all of this knowledge about them, but you don't really realize what you've acquired. And so suddenly you don't explain things well enough because you just think everyone knows the same level about that client or about that product or that service as you do, and you forget that actually that's learned knowledge, that's not inherent. And that can be a big thing as well. And also confirmation bias. So this is where, rather than just seeking to see whether something is a good idea maybe, we seek to just confirm it. So if I wanted to learn whether the sky was blue, I think the sky is blue. But what I should really Google if I want to confirm that is, what color is the sky? That's an open question. That could give me any kind of answer. It might actually tell me the sky is green and I'm colorblind. But if I Google, is the sky blue, all I'm seeking to do there is confirm that what I think, that the sky is blue, is indeed correct. I'm not actually looking for the answer. I'm just looking for confirmation of my view. And we do this, again, a lot without realizing we're doing it. But when we want to see if something's a good idea or if something will relate to people, we need to make sure we're being more open with what we ask and what we look for, as opposed to just seeking to confirm our own views and our own opinions. A few ways we do this. So I have something that I call the pub test, and this is where I basically it doesn't have to be just at a pub, but I'll get people together that aren't anything to do with the client or the campaign and don't work in PR or digital marketing. I'll start talking to them about a topic, and I'll see if they relate to it. I'll see if it is actually something that they're interested in, because if it is, that shows that it's not just me, it's not just my own knowledge bias, I'm not just seeking to confirm what I already know. It actually is something that people relate to and are interested in. Whereas if I just start saying something and they're like, oh yeah, that's cool, and then they change the subject, I'm like, wow, I really was wrong here. People don't care about this, I shouldn't do this. But what we also do, coming back to having that middle audience as well, is we get journalist feedback on our ideas. So we say to journalists that we're friends with, or friendly with, not necessarily friends with, we're thinking about doing this campaign, we're thinking about doing this story, would you be interested? So we get their buy-in and their feedback up front rather than just falling in love with our own ideas and our own campaigns, which has proven really helpful for us. Another thing when we're talking about digital PR in particular and trying to help SEO is we're often trying to get links within our coverage. But often the biggest mistake is that people aren't worth the link. So a press release doesn't justify a link. Pretty picture, as much as I've said visuals are important, it doesn't justify a link. Journalists can write about it anyway. Interesting data doesn't justify a link. Journalists can cover all of this stuff and write articles with no reason to link with any of this. They would only link if they're feeling nice. I saw this with one of the campaigns that I ran, which thankfully wasn't just aimed at getting links, so it wasn't a huge issue for me and the client. But we did, it was for a dance company, and we were looking at the most iconic dancers of all times, and we looked at them from a music video perspective, from a film perspective, all different stuff. And so we had interesting data. So we found out that Dirty Dancing was the #1 dance scene in a film of all time, which didn't shock anyone. But that was the kind of the stat, and we had the images, as you can see, of the iconic scenes, but we didn't have anything else. We had interesting data, we had interesting visuals, but there was no reason for a journalist to link, and therefore they didn't. So they wrote about it, and it was great brand awareness for our client, but it didn't get a link, because that was our mistake. We didn't put anything on the client's website that made people go and explore more and do more on the website that journalists would link to. So you need to create something that journalists can't tell the story about without linking. So just giving them data is not enough. Just giving them visuals isn't enough. We'll often create kind of interactive assets that will sit on a client's site so that people can go and explore. It might be an interactive map. It might be some kind of data visualization. But it gives a reason for people to go and link to the site and explore something more. You need to outline the value that your link adds. So when you're asking a journalist to include it, we might say something like, it'd be great if you could send your users to the interactive map so that they can find out more about their local area as well. That's the value that it has. The next thing is all around timing. So you haven't thought about your timing. You need to give a journalist a reason to write about something now. They get hundreds of emails every day. You need to make sure yours stands out and they action it straight away, which means you need to know the news agenda. So that piece that I just mentioned, one of our headlines, as I said, we also looked at music videos, and we found out that Michael Jackson's music videos accounted for half of the top 10 that people voted for, which in itself was a great stat. But what also happened at the same time that we were pitching that was this documentary came out, which meant that anyone that was writing about Michael Jackson was not writing about him in a complimentary way. They did not want to cover our story about how he was king of the charts. So you need to know the news agenda and make sure your timing matches up to it. The other thing can be someone else releases the same thing, which is hard for you to do too much about. But you need to be conscious of it. And so we tried to have a backup plan and keep angles back. So again, with that piece, we had the Michael Jackson angle, which kind of fell flat on its face because of that documentary, but we had the Dirty Dancing angle. So we hadn't just put all our hopes on Michael Jackson, thankfully. We had the other angles that we could go out with to still make it a success for our client. The final thing is your data is not shocking. So I talked about data being really useful for getting these stories and getting journalists to write about you, but there does need to be something shocking and something surprising about it, usually. This was a campaign that we did, and we were looking at expectations versus reality of life's big moments. So what we thought was that the age that people think they're going to get married and settle down and have a baby is actually different to when it happens. So like when you're younger, you think, oh yeah, sure, I'll be like married and have a baby by the time I'm 30, like that'll all be done. And then you get to approaching 30 and you're like, wow, I haven't done either of those things, that's quite scary. And we thought that that's what the data would show. So we found the average age that people expected to do each thing, and then we found the average age that people did that thing. Now you don't need to be a mathematician to see that those numbers are not that different. So that data is not shocking in itself. And we didn't consider that. We spoke to a lot of people and everyone said, yeah, I got married way after I thought I would, or I had a baby way after I thought I would. But the data doesn't show that. Now, what the data for this did show was that there is a difference between our own perceptions of when we'll do something and when it happens. But if we look at an average as a whole across the country, there's not really much difference. Now, with the exception of the Dirty Dancing piece, this is a big problem. Data needs to be shocking. We need to, again, coming back to emotions, we need to surprise people with what we're doing. Otherwise, it's just boring. No one cares about that. So we pre-test surveys and quizzes now with people to get the data to a small degree in advance to make sure it's going to show what we want it to show. The final thing, falling at the last hurdle. So you've done all of this work, you've taken all of this into account, but then you don't do the very last steps. And by this, I mean the basics. So cross-browser or platform testing. Not every journalist uses an iPhone or Android. They use different things. They use different web browsers. Make sure you've tested that that's going to work. Make sure you've got tracking codes on there. So if you report using Google Analytics, make sure that code's on every page. Otherwise, you can't report on the value of your campaign, your content, whatever it might be. We have a pre-launch checklist that we use. These slides will go around. So just make sure you're checking all of that, or you have your own internal checklist at least. And only sending one email or phone call. So if you're pitching a journalist, you send your pitch email, you don't get a response. A lot of people will just leave it there, but always send a follow-up. We get a 250% increase in replies to our follow-up emails than our original emails. It's always worth sending that follow-up. So just to recap, you need to make sure you know your audience. You need to understand the size matters, and it matters differently to different publications. You need to have the full package. Think emotions, think visuals, think all of that. Think about your bias. Try to test outside it. Be conscious of unconscious bias. Make sure you're worth the link if that is what you're going for. Make sure you've thought about timing, why someone would write about it now, and that nothing else is going to happen that will detract from that. If you are using data, make sure it's actually going to shock and surprise people as much as you can. And make sure you don't fall at the last hurdle. Always do your checks before you launch, and always follow up with people. It's always worth your time. And thank you for having me.